All right. Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here. We are going to be jumping into our first lesson as part of Oosh. And so what we're going to be starting with is kind of like 1491, if you will. And that is looking at the Americas. But not only that, some important things too. We'll talk about kind of how we approach history generally as a historian. And then also we'll wrap up with a little mini lesson here on the Iroquois. There's your warm-up back in the previous slide. Just go ahead and click on the block to do that. Once you do that, we're going to be using something today called Pear Deck. So what you're going to do is once you're done with your warm-up, you're going to go to slide number 2 and you're going to click the pair that goes along with your block. What Pear Deck allows us to do, and I'm actually using it right here, so you'll be able to see kind of like what you would be doing, is it actually allows you to draw on like our slides, which is really, really cool. Not only that, it allows you to make, type in, answers and, do lots of really, really cool things. When you click on Pear Deck, log in with Microsoft, and then it should hop you probably to this slide right here. From there, you just go into slide number 3 and you can kind of join me and let's look at our objectives. Here's our kind of 3-part objectives. The first, we're going to look at the method of how Amerindians, you'll hear me use the word Amerindians, interchangeably with First Nations peoples or Indigenous Americans, and how they got to North America. Second, we're going to look at some of the kind of bigger conclusions that archaeologists have made about some of these Amerindian societies. And then last but not least, we're going to take a special moment and use the Iroquois as like a case study to look at Native American kind of societies in the Eastern Woodlands. Cool. So you'll notice here, no Europeans, right? We will not be mentioning them at all today. The first thing we need to talk about, though, is Moana. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to, you can see here on this slide, it says, using the picture on the next slide, you're going to draw your prediction for how Amerindians first reached North America. And so, what you're going to then do, okay, is you go to the slide, and all of a sudden we have a canvas that pops up. And this is where you get to draw. Now, we know that human beings originated in Africa, so I'll give you that hint. But what I'd like you to do after that point is I'd like you to actually then figure out with arrows how did humans get to all the places. So you can draw the past here. The only rule that I have is that, so if this were my sample, okay, here's how Native Americans got to the Americas. There needs to be arrows going to every major continent. So Australia, North America, South America, Africa, etc., etc. Okay? Once you're done, your answer automatically submits and you can just go on. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something called the land bridge thesis. Now, what is this? Well, I'm going to guess there were at least a few of you, and I'm going to go ahead and erase here. If I could have a larger eraser, that'd be great, but that's okay. I'm going to guess, there we go, Sizer, that there were a few of you who maybe learned somewhere that there was this magical land bridge that occurred. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, here you go. It was this idea, so again, human beings start in Africa, they spread up to places like Europe, and then here's how this theory goes, right? They go down to Australia. And then you were kind of left with this question, well, like, okay, so how did human beings reach the Americas? Well, there's this theory that, sorry, flat earthers, this does connect, that there's this, this magical land bridge that somehow existed between Russia and Alaska, and then peoples crossed that, and that's how they got to the Americas. I am so sorry to tell you that this is a bunch of garbage. It's simply not true. So we're going to take the next activity here. You can click on this piece of paper down here. We're going to talk about Charles C. Mann and the book 1491, excuse me. And we're going to talk about why is this a bunch of hogwash. There's something very wrong with this theory. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. There's just it's like 2 pages, and there's like 1 sentence on the 3rd page. And Charles Mann, he was the author of this book called 1491. And he basically did some really good work and wrote a fantastic text that basically looked at how we got this land bridge thesis and why there's no way that it's possibly true. So what I'm going to have you do here, okay, is read Charles C. Mann's opinion and other archaeologists' opinion about why this is wrong. Okay, so there's a short reading here. And then if we go down, over here on the right, on Pear Deck, you're going to say, how do we know that this wasn't right? What does he tell us about its improbability? And so you can type your answers there on Pear Deck, okay? And we'll discuss them as a class as well. So what do we know about how migration actually happened? Okay, so this is, I'll go ahead and I'm going to spoil the answer. So like you want to pause, if you haven't yet. I'm actually going to back up to the slides on here because I can show you a little bit better on Google Slides without the map being in the way. So here's what we know, okay? And this is why I call the correct answer the Moana thesis. That is my own name for it, but I like it because it's easy for you to remember. Okay, so I'm going to put myself in Africa, just because for the sake of argument, my head is out of the way. So if human beings start here, right, in Africa, where they go from that point is very, very important. So if you don't know, there was a group called Neanderthals. They left earlier than Homo sapiens, but they die out. We can get into that later. But then human beings spread, right? And so, again, they reach Australia. They do, in fact, reach places up in, like, northern Russia. That absolutely is true. But then here's where all of a sudden the land bridge thesis really falls apart. And some of the evidence that we'll talk about in class is, like, for example, there's this magical, somehow, according to C. Vance Hayes, who was the creator of this theory, he had no evidence to support it. He argued that there was this magical ice-free corridor right here that human beings traveled on. We simply don't have any evidence that, for example, any large mammals were here. We don't have any evidence of humans. Like, so for example, we might expect to find bones or like hunting and gathering, things like that. There's none. Also, I'll just tell you, Alaska is really cold. Okay, so even if a land bridge did exist here, human beings, the simple likelihood that they would have been able to cross that there's no way. It is. I mean, guys, I went to Alaska on spring break. This is about 5 years ago, and in the spring it was minus 60 with wind chill. Like, simply put, there's no way that human beings would have ever willingly migrated across that without a promise of food being there. And he talks about that too in his article. Like, human beings really didn't chase long distances after protein because, simply put, like, on average, for you to, again, I'm talking primitive technology, kill what you needed to get protein, you expended as many calories trying to kill it as you got back from the animal. Again, on average. So then we're left with, okay, so like, well, what then? Well, like, what do we do? You haven't given us any answers. Well, here's where we have some good evidence, okay? First, what Charles C. Mann goes on to argue is that there were likely two different ways that human beings got to the Americas, and probably it happened over, he says, anywhere from like 3 to 4 different migrations. We know this in a bunch of ways. One, it's much easier for human beings to travel on water. Okay, so the first route that we know for a fact happened was coast hopping. So yeah, they almost used the land bridge, but it's way easier to travel on water. It would have been warmer. There would have been, actual food like fish. So that did occur. We know that happened. The second way, which I think is also very interesting, is, or at least the second part of the Moana thesis, as I call it, is that Polynesian peoples crossed across in boats, okay, hit places like Hawaii. How do you think people got there, right? And then eventually settled in places like South America. We know this from a bunch of different things. We actually found some of their canoes, which look remarkably like Moana. They've been pretty well preserved. And then we've also found different plants and animal species that exist in Polynesia. So again, like over here by Australia, and also in South America. So things like bottle gourds, sweet potatoes, those kind of things. So we know that human beings must have brought those foods with them. There's also some very strange ways that we've measured that this is true as well. So, for example, scientists have measured the mitochondria of chicken DNA, and they've compared it between these two places, and they find that they're similar. There's a link there. There's also been lots and lots and lots of genetic studies of First Nations peoples in these places and places like Australia and Russia. So this is how we think migration actually happened. So what we're going to do now, okay, is we're going to go back to our drawing here, and I'm going to kind of cycle back quickly. And I would like you on Pear Deck now to update and erase on Pear Deck and give yourself now the correct drawing of how human beings got to North America. So using the Moana thesis. I don't ever want to hear no nonsense about a land bridge. Okay? It's simply, it's like saying that aliens made the pyramids. Like, you can say it all you want to, but the more you say it doesn't make it true. Like, we don't have any evidence. Okay, so there we go. Woo! Awesome. So before we get into our first thing in notes, a few kind of tips here, because we're about to do our first mini lesson. We just kind of did, again, a drawing activity and a short article there. The first thing, do not write what is word for word on the slides. It's simply put like a waste of your time. Like, there's words like a, the, and that don't matter. So like, I don't know, and I give the sample sentence, like General Washington crossed the Delaware. Like, just write Wash Arrow Del. Like, you don't need to write out every letter, especially for handwriting notes. You need to think like every word and symbol that I write takes me time, and that's time that I'm perhaps not listening, or, drawing, doing some doodles over the side of my page, which might help me remember information later. Again, I encourage you to think about like people, places, things last, and more about like how and why and some of those really big points. And again, I actively encourage doodling because, again, it will help you remember things for later. But again, how you take notes is totally up to you. As you can see here, we're going to end with a mini lesson on the Iroquois and also some good historical thinking. And once we do that, we'll be all done. So there's a digital copies of the notes page right here that you can grab. Feel free. And other than that, of course, I'll have copies, hand copies in class. So we've kind of got two different goals here. The first is looking at like how do we actually think as historians. And the second thing is how did the Iroquois master and manage their world? Now, what are these essential questions? There's no good single answer to these. These are thinking questions. So, for example, like how do historians approach the study of the past? There's lots of different answers for that. So these are really, really good questions that you can think about and reflect on, maybe using for a test or something like that. They tend to be about the biggest topics that we're focusing on in a particular lesson, which is always a good idea when we're thinking about like what we should learn and what we should get out of tests. So let's talk about historians first, not to be like self-centered and biased. So source-wise for historians, historians like writing a lot. They very, very like they're addicted to writing, basically. But there's two kinds of writing and sources that you need to be aware of. There are what we call primary sources, so that's people who witness something, okay? So like a primary source might be like a diary or, like a newspaper, somebody who witnessed something there, right? As opposed to a secondary source. So what a secondary source is like, imagine this was a history book, right? That what I would do is I would go find a bunch of primary sources of somebody who, saw something, whatever. And then what I would do is I would write a book about my interpretation of those events. A source that interprets info, that is a secondary source, like to the T. Now, what else do historians do? Like, we just don't like be like, okay, great, I got a source, like let's move on. Historians are very, very cautious by nature. And I would encourage you to be so as well. You have to be really, really careful about the sources that we use. So, like, for example, you can imagine, like, only trying to understand, the perspective of World War II through Winston Churchill's eyes. You're probably going to get a pretty biased perspective, right? It's going to be very very pro-British. And so we try to think about things like the backgrounds of our sources and how useful they are. But we also have to be careful of lots of other things as well, things that are kind of more going on with us today. So a lot of history that we think about and we kind of meditate on, we have to be really careful of a couple things. The first is one called hindsight. And hindsight is when we look back at the past and we judge it from what we know now. So what this would be an example of is like saying, oh, well, they should have seen World War II coming in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, it's really easy for us to sit back and say, oh, like they should have seen that. Somebody should have invented the internet earlier. What they say is hindsight is 20/20, right? It's always easy to look back and say like, oh, they should have done this. Things and how reality operates is that people make decisions based on the context of their own time. Right? Now, that doesn't prevent us from looking back at the past and being like, that was terrible and that was awful and we shouldn't do that anymore, right? That's just learning. But at the same time, it becomes a much more complicated thing for us to look at when we're trying to see history through somebody's particular eyes. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with everything that person does, but it certainly all of a sudden makes things a little bit more complex for us, if that kind of makes sense. And again, historians try to be very aware of their biases. Now, notice I did not say we try to get rid of all of our biases. That's simply impossible. Everybody carries bias with them. It's something that we try to be aware of what those lenses are, and we try to, again, at least give a voice and a perspective to those people who we are in particular studying. Okay, even if we disagree or agree with it or however we feel about it. Okay, so how are you basically, this slide is like the do not and the do slide. So we are not here for basically in this class in VU for what I would call like common sense thinking. One correct answer that never changes. What is that? Well, that's like saying like, oh, I can see what that problem is, like here, and I always come up with this answer. It's like, what we need to do? I always get students who say this, like, we need to just nuke them. Like, that's their first go-to. Or, I know what the solution is, America. Like, no. Like, history and reality is much more complex, and, people are complicated. And so you can see how a historian thinks there is that when we look at the past, very rarely will we come up with, like, a single answer to something. Typically, it's multiple answers, and we do that after a lot of critical thinking and kind of reflecting. Also, we try to be aware that it's very problematic if we judge history from a single perspective. So it's why we try to use multiple sources, multiple perspectives. It's why we use lots of lenses into things. And also we avoid that hindsight issue, current time looking backwards, and instead we can use history to kind of tell us how we should think about current events, right? So we can actually learn from it and make some good choices. What you're going to do on Pear Deck now, so I've given you some different examples of primary and secondary sources, is you are going to draw a line on this slide from primary sources to the word primary and secondary sources to the word secondary. Oh, pretty relax. Oh, hush. You're fine. What? What do you need? I think you're fine. I do. I think you're fine. Come here. I think you're fine, honey. So what you're going to do then below is you're going to write an example of each. One primary source and one secondary source. Okay? Awesome. Let's finish this up because I've taken too long. We get to talk about the Iroquois now. Okay? I promise we're almost done. This is long for me for a video explanation, but we'll get through it. So let's talk about the Iroquois. Okay? So we're in future day, current day, North America. And who are the Iroquois? Yes, I know it looks like Iroquois. I promise it's pronounced Iroquois. The Iroquois are a group of First Nation peoples, okay, who are living in what would eventually become New York State. Okay, it's a part of North America we would call like the Eastern Woodlands. But the Iroquois are kind of in a lot of ways exceptions to the rule for a lot of at least the political organization of First Nation tribes. And here's what I mean by that. So the Iroquois are unique, and that's because they were a confederacy. So the Iroquois Confederacy was made up of first by 5 different groups: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Later, it was the Tuscarora who kind of get tagged into there. So the Iroquois are interesting because the reason why they're in this confederacy, which again is super unique, is because they shared a similar language tree, and that is Iroquoian. And as you can see there, they're well known for their longhouses. But the thing that makes the Iroquois also really cool is just kind of, again, this kind of political setup, right? Their economy was based on trade. Again, because of their political organization, better organized and defined. If you're wondering, like, how did they make decisions? Because they were a confederacy, how they made decisions was a council of leaders that would come together for, from different tribes. But unanimity was required for the Iroquois to act in concert. Now, of course, there could be one nation of the Iroquois who would make, a different choice than the others, absolutely. But if there was something they were going to be doing as labeled all Iroquois, that required a unanimous decision. Everybody had to agree. Allies and enemies, this is just something that you need to kind of understand about really most Native American groups when Europeans show up, and that is Native American peoples, broadly speaking, and again, we're talking early history here, is that one of the ways that they play for political power is by aligning themselves with certain European groups when they show up, and then playing against other European groups when they showed up. And so this is kind of like playing your parents off of each other. If your mom says you can't do this, and then you go to your other parent, and they're like, this person said this, can I? And they're like, yeah, fine, sure, right? And so by playing different Europeans, and eventually later American colonists off of each other, it allows them, the Iroquois in particular, to last for a very long time. Traditionally, the Iroquois' allies were the British, and their enemies were the French. But again, alliances change and shift over time, right? Here's kind of the thing to understand with the Iroquois, but then also really for a lot of First Nation peoples. Once, I guess we can say, now that we kind of understand the basics. The first is that the Iroquois didn't always act in unison. We mentioned that. Okay, and again, getting a unanimous decision on anything is really hard. Even today, try to get all your friends to agree to go to one place. It's really difficult. And so that does, in a way, kind of make them administratively weak, in a sense, because again, getting everybody to get along is hard. But then when Europeans show up, and we'll talk about this more next class, really the vast majority of all Native American groups are going to have 3 options and the Iroquois are going to be faced with the same thing, with 3 choices of what they can do. And the first one is you fight back against Europeans, and ultimately, if you try to fight back to the very end, you die, because when Europeans start coming, they simply do not stop. The second option is you negotiate with Europeans, and as the Iroquois did, right? They were very good about, allying with some and then, becoming enemies of others. The problem with that is eventually, as time goes on, as Europeans take more and more land and, again, more of these First Nations traditional, people's traditional way of life is kind of interrupted, that way of life is lost. And so that also sucks. To say the least. And then the third option is you run away, but then again, you still lose everything. And so you can see here, there's no really good answer. Now, the general trend for most Native American groups with colonists is that the early relationship, with some definite exceptions, early relationships with between Europeans and natives somewhat tedious, I think, is a safe word. Some did not go well. Some went okay. Again, very tedious is the word that I would kind of refer to. But later, nearly all of them turned violent in one way, shape, or form, for reasons that we'll get into. Okay, cool. So we've got our exit ticket. We'll do that. And then once we do that, we should be almost done. And this is going to be your first bit of homework. So we're going to talk about some different things that you can do to help you with best practices in reading. Once we get done with that, sorry guys. Once we get done with that, there's going to be our first plus stuff homework. And it's going to be in Schoology. It's going to be called Why Did Cortex Win? So go ahead and make sure you have that done for next block. It's going to be our first plus stuff reading. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you next lesson. All right, my dogs are going crazy, so I got to go. All right, bye.
Daddy, can I play with water balloons?
Can you play with water balloons? Absolutely.